For 33 years, I played the quiet, compliant daughter. That ended on a crowded morning train when my phone buzzed. A text from my sister read, "Goodbye. Everything is in the trash." Beneath it sat a photo of my belongings piled by the garbage cans. They thought that picture would finally break me. Instead, zooming in on one tiny, irreversible mistake in the frame, I smiled. They had just handed me the exact legal proof needed to destroy them. My name is Addison Perry. I am 33 years old, a woman of Irish-American descent who has spent exactly 1 decade trying to blend into the background of my own chaotic family. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of the southbound train moving from Baltimore to Washington, District of Columbia, was usually my only sanctuary. It was a freezing Tuesday morning. The windows of the passenger car were fogged thick with the condensation of dozens of exhausted commuters. I sat in my usual window seat, holding a lukewarm cup of bitter black coffee, watching the blurred industrial sprawl of Maryland slide by. I work as a senior data compliance officer at Meridian Arc Risk Labs. It is a title that sounds dry to most, but to me, it is the bedrock of reality. My job revolves around what records can prove. I analyze risk. I archive evidence. I track the microscopic anomalies that ordinary people overlook until those anomalies trigger a corporate collapse. I live by principles, order, and the meticulous preservation of facts. I document everything. I save every receipt, log every maintenance request, and photograph conditions before and after. Naturally, my family has always found this aspect of my personality utterly insufferable. To my father, Dennis, my insistence on clear agreements was a direct insult to his authority as the patriarch. To my mother, Elaine, my quiet boundaries were a personal rejection of her constant emotional theatrics. And to my younger sister, Brooke, I was simply an obstacle. I was the rigid, boring hurdle standing between her and whatever she wanted at any given moment. They called my habits annoying. They told me I was too tense, too calculating, incapable of just letting things be. The train swayed heavily, metal groaning against the curved tracks. The muted, sleepy chatter of the carriage was abruptly pierced by the sharp, aggressive vibration of my phone inside my wool coat pocket. It buzzed once, then twice. Then it settled into a continuous, frantic rhythm that meant only one thing: the family group chat was active. I pulled the device out. The bright, harsh glare of the screen cut through the dim, gray morning light of the train car. A notification banner dropped down from the top edge. It was a direct message from Brooke. "Goodbye. Everything is in the trash." My thumb hovered over the cold glass. I tapped the notification, opening the main family chat. Before I could even begin to process the sheer cruelty of her text, an image loaded directly beneath it. It was a high-resolution photograph taken behind the Hampton townhouse. The damp, aging brick wall of the back alley served as the backdrop for a sprawling, pathetic mountain of my life. Black plastic trash bags had been violently ripped open, spilling my winter coats, my carefully folded sweaters, and my running shoes onto the wet concrete. Cardboard boxes were overturned. I could clearly see the spine of my favorite college textbook soaking in a dirty puddle of rainwater. My personal belongings, the fragile anchors of my everyday existence, had been tossed beside the rusted municipal garbage bins like hazardous waste. A second later, a new message popped up beneath the terrible image. It was from my father, Dennis Perry. He had reacted to the picture of my ruined life with a large, bright yellow laughing emoji. The digital face grinned up at me, mocking and hollow, a clear endorsement of Brooke's destruction. Then came my mother. Elaine Perry never missed an opportunity to wrap a knife in a lace handkerchief. Her message appeared in a soft, light blue bubble. "You should learn to let go. Sweetheart, this is for the best." A normal person would have broken down right there in the middle of the crowded train carriage. A normal daughter would have felt the sudden, blinding sting of hot tears. She would have dialed her sister in a blind panic or fired off a barrage of furious, desperate texts demanding an immediate explanation. For 33 years, my family had relied entirely on that exact reaction. They thrived on the drama. They fed on the chaotic, emotional fallout of their own cruelty. It was a cycle they had perfected. I did not cry. I did not call them. I did not type a single letter of protest. Instead, my professional compliance training took over. My heart rate steadied into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. I placed my coffee cup into the plastic holder attached to the seat in front of me and used both hands to hold the phone. I brought the screen closer to my face and pinched the glass, zooming deep into the background of Brooke's triumphant photograph. I looked past the torn garbage bags. I looked past the scattered shoes. I looked past the damp cardboard and the ruined clothing. There, tucked into the extreme lower right corner of the frame, partially obscured by a ripped black trash bag, was a heavy dark oak box. It was a vintage craftsman's tool chest. Engraved deeply into the brass plate on the lid were the initials of my late grandfather. But it was not the sentimental value that made the breath catch in my throat. It was the small, laminated white tag dangling from the heavy brass handle. It was an inventory barcode, a sequence of numbers and letters that only I recognized. Brooke thought she was being incredibly clever. She thought she was establishing absolute dominance by tossing out my old clothes and personal clutter. She had absolutely no idea what she had actually done. By touching that specific oak box, moving it from the interior of the grandfather's house, and dumping it by the alleyway bins, she had crossed a massive, fatal legal line. That tool chest was not my personal property. It was formally registered in an active, legally protected estate inventory. It was part of a trust over which I held absolute, documented jurisdiction. She had not merely committed a petty act of sibling bullying. She had just documented herself committing unauthorized interference with protected estate assets. It was a severe civil violation, and thanks to the time-stamped, high-definition photograph she had so proudly broadcasted to the family group chat, I had proof. The tight knot in my chest completely dissolved, replaced by an icy, absolute calm. The train rumbled loudly over a bridge, the steel structure clanking beneath us. I swiped out of the messaging application and opened the encrypted, password-protected folder on my phone's secure drive. It was a digital vault I had meticulously maintained for the last 8 days, compiling the exact documentation needed for this precise, inevitable scenario. I did not need to search through the files. I knew exactly which ones to select. I tapped the first file, a short, clear video recording of my grandfather. I tapped the second file, a heavy, dense PDF containing 30 pages of watermarked legal injunctions, fully signed and verified by an estate attorney. I selected the share icon. I routed the 2 files directly into the family group chat. I did not add a caption. I did not write a single word of warning, anger, or triumph. Silence, I had learned from years in my profession, was always the most terrifying sound to the guilty. I pressed send. The blue progress bar dashed quickly across the top of the screen. A small swoosh sounded from the phone's tiny speaker. Delivered. Read by Brooke. Read by Dennis. Read by Elaine. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly 2 minutes and 45 seconds later, the retaliation began. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. The screen flashed bright white with an incoming call from Brooke. I watched her name bounce on the screen for 3 seconds before the call dropped, instantly replaced by an incoming call from my father. Then my mother called. Then Brooke called again. The group chat began to flood with frantic, desperate text bubbles, appearing faster than the screen could even render them. The arrogant laughter was gone. The fake morality was completely gone. Only sheer, unadulterated panic remained. I did not read the new messages. I calmly swiped down from the top right corner of my screen and pressed the small icon shaped like an airplane. The cellular signal instantly died. The wireless internet disconnected. The phone went completely dark and completely silent in my palm. I slipped the device back into my warm wool coat pocket and picked up my coffee cup. I leaned my head against the cool, vibrating glass of the train window and watched the gray, towering skyline of Washington slowly rise on the horizon. My family genuinely thought they had just ended my spirit with a pile of trash in an alleyway. They had absolutely no idea the real war had just begun. And with one single photograph, they had already lost. Exactly 8 days before my phone lit up with that photograph on the morning train. The true hostility had quietly slipped through the front door of my grandfather's Hampton townhouse. It was a Sunday evening. I had received a brief, vaguely worded message from my mother requesting my presence in the living room for a family discussion. The air inside the house felt immediately thick and unbreathable the moment I walked in. They had arranged themselves like a tribunal. My father, Dennis, sat in my grandfather's worn leather recliner, his posture stiff and authoritative, projecting a false sense of ownership over a room he had never contributed a single dime toward. My mother, Elaine, occupied the center of the floral sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing an expression of practiced, sorrowful concern. And then there was Brooke. My younger sister sat slouched on the love seat, wrapped in an oversized knit blanket. She was putting on a spectacular performance of absolute exhaustion. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair was deliberately messy, and she stared blankly at the coffee table as if the weight of the entire world had just collapsed onto her shoulders. Brooke's latest venture, an online boutique selling overpriced, imported home goods, had completely imploded. She had burned through her investors, maximized her credit limits, and now her cash flow was non-existent. That much I already knew. What I did not know was how they planned to make her failure my immediate problem. Dennis cleared his throat, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. He used his slow, measured voice, the one he always deployed when he wanted to sound reasonable while demanding something outrageous. He explained that Brooke was facing a severe financial crisis. She needed to restructure a mountain of debt, and to do that without facing immediate personal bankruptcy. She required a stable, permanent residential address. Her luxury apartment lease was expiring in 14 days, and she had zero funds to renew it. Then came the pivot. My father looked me directly in the eyes and presented their temporary solution. They wanted me to pack up my life, move out of the townhouse, and let Brooke take over the property. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I looked at the three of them, trying to process the sheer audacity of the demand. I found my voice, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of the panic they were clearly expecting. I reminded them that this house was not a shared family asset. It was not a spare bedroom for whenever someone made a terrible life choice. Since our grandfather passed away, I had been the sole caretaker of the property. I reminded Dennis that it was my bank account that was drained to pay the property taxes for the last 2 years. I was the one who spent $6,000 upgrading the ancient, fire hazard electrical system. I was the one who spent countless weekends fixing the plumbing, maintaining the structural integrity, and keeping meticulous records of every single repair. Brooke suddenly threw off her blanket, her fragile victim persona vanishing in a fraction of a second. She glared at me, her voice sharp and defensive. She snapped that I was acting like I owned the place just because I paid a few bills. She argued that the property was family heritage, and then, in her heated rush to win the argument, she made a fatal tactical error. She yelled that the secondary beneficiary addendum clearly stated the house was meant to provide shelter for direct descendants in times of hardship. I froze. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The secondary beneficiary addendum. That specific legal term was buried deep within a sealed envelope inside my locked filing cabinet upstairs. It was a document my grandfather had drafted privately. Brooke had absolutely no legitimate way of knowing that phrase. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. While I had been at work, putting in 10-hour shifts to afford the upkeep of this very house, My family had been systematically hunting through my personal space. They had rummaged through my home office. They had either picked the lock on my desk or somehow accessed my digital backups before I could address the blatant invasion of my privacy. My mother unleashed her specialty. Elaine's voice trembled with forced tears as she shifted the narrative toward emotional blackmail. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, calling me bitterly selfish. She launched into a tearful monologue about how family must sacrifice for one another, entirely ignoring the fact that the only person ever expected to do the sacrificing was me. She recounted every imagined slight, weaving a narrative where I was the cold, calculating older sister who refused to throw a lifeline to a sibling who was drowning. She asked how I could possibly sleep at night in a 4-bedroom house while my own flesh and blood faced the prospect of having nowhere to go. It was the exact same script they had used for 20 years, designed to drown logic in a flood of manufactured guilt. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to demand how Brooke knew about the addendum. But Dennis immediately cut me off. He stood up, towering over the coffee table, abandoning the reasonable father act entirely. He pointed a thick finger at me and dropped his final threat. He claimed he had recently bought drinks for a legal acquaintance who worked down at the county courthouse. According to this friend, Dennis stated with supreme arrogance, whoever physically possessed the original paper deed held the ultimate leverage. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. He told me that since I could not produce the original, notarized deed right that very second, my position was completely worthless. He told me I had no solid ground to stand on, and if I forced them to make it ugly, the courts would easily side with the family unit over a single, uncooperative occupant. In the past, the younger version of Addison Perry would have engaged. I would have yelled, cried, and desperately tried to present logical arguments to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. But the woman sitting on that sofa was a senior risk analyst. I looked at my father's aggressive posture, my mother's fake tears, and my sister's greedy, expectant eyes. I saw the entire board. This was not a desperate plea for a few months of free rent. This was a premeditated, coordinated hostile takeover. They had snooped through my files. They had consulted outside advice. They had planned this ambush perfectly. Arguing with them in this room was a waste of breath. You do not negotiate with people who are actively trying to steal from you. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers, looked at each of them in total silence, and walked out of the living room. I ignored my mother's dramatic gasp and my father's demanding shouts as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I pulled the curtain shut and dragged the heavy metal lockbox from the back of my closet. It was the box my grandfather had handed to me in the hospital, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man, explicitly telling me to only open it when they finally crossed the line. Sitting on the floor under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp, I broke the wax seal. I began to audit every single document, every payment history, and every legal clause inside. I spent the next 8 hours building a fortress of paper and ink. My family believed they had successfully cornered me into surrendering my home. They were about to learn that cornering a compliance officer who holds all the receipts is the most dangerous mistake a person can make. The screen of my phone illuminated the dark bedroom exactly at 7 in the morning. I had not slept a single minute. The documents from the lockbox were spread across my bedspread like a map of a battlefield. Among the faded receipts and old tax records, I had found a crisp white business card. Evelyn Cross, estate planning attorney. Before I could even dial the number printed on the card, my phone vibrated in my palm. It was a local Baltimore area code. I answered on the first ring. The voice on the other end was brisk, professional, and entirely devoid of morning lethargy. It was Evelyn herself. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply instructed me to be at her office in the Mount Vernon neighborhood in exactly 1 hour. She specified that I should make sure I was not followed and that I should not mention this meeting to anyone, especially my parents or my sister. Mount Vernon in the early daylight felt worlds away from the claustrophobia of the Hampton townhouse. The grand, historic brick buildings stood tall and silent against the freezing wind. Evelyn's office was tucked into the second floor of a restored 19th century brownstone. There was no flashy billboard, only a small brass plaque next to the heavy wooden door. Evelyn Cross was a formidable woman in her late 60s. She wore a sharp gray suit and had a gaze that felt like a physical weight. She gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite her heavy mahogany desk. She folded her hands and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and intense calculation. She explained that she had drafted the documents I found in the lockbox, but she had deliberately avoided contacting me since my grandfather passed away. This was not an oversight. It was a strict, written directive from my grandfather himself. He had established a very specific trigger condition. Evelyn was legally bound to remain entirely silent until there was documented evidence of coercion, an attempted hostile occupation of the primary residence, or a coordinated effort to publicly defame my character. My frantic, encrypted email to her firm's secure server at 3 a.m, detailing the ambush in the living room, had officially activated the protocol. Evelyn opened a thick, fireproof safe behind her desk and pulled out a heavy black folder. She set it down in front of me. She told me to forget everything my family thought they knew about property law. She slid the first document across the polished wood. It was a formal trust certificate. My eyes scanned the dense legal text. For decades, my father had loudly proclaimed that the house was simply deeded to my grandfather, waiting to be tossed into probate court where Dennis could easily stake a massive claim as the closest living male relative. That was the foundation of their entire strategy. But the document in my hands destroyed that foundation completely, exactly 2 years before his death. My grandfather had quietly transferred the physical deed of the Hampton townhouse into a revocable living trust. He was the initial trustee. I was officially named the sole successor trustee and the primary, uncontested beneficiary. The house did not belong to him anymore, and it certainly did not belong to my parents or my sister. It belonged to the trust, and I controlled the trust. Evelyn watched my expression change. She nodded, sliding a second document toward me. It was a beneficiary amendment addendum, accompanied by a comprehensive transition of property management protocol to be used explicitly in the event of an intra-family dispute. Then, Evelyn reached for her laptop. She turned the screen to face me and entered a long alphanumeric password. A video file appeared on the screen. She pressed play. Seeing my grandfather's face hit me harder than I expected. He looked tired, sitting in the very same leather recliner my father had so arrogantly occupied the night before. But his voice was incredibly clear and steady. The video lasted exactly 42 seconds. In that brief span of time, he dismantled every lie my family had ever told themselves. He stared directly into the camera lens and stated, without any hesitation, that he had zero faith in Dennis Perry's financial competency. He explicitly named my mother as an enabler and called Brooke a reckless liability. He said he knew they would eventually come for the house. He knew they would try to bleed me dry to cover their own endless mistakes. Then, his tone shifted to something sharp and deeply serious. He raised his index finger, warning me about a specific clause he had built into the estate. He emphasized that certain physical items left inside the house were not mere household clutter or sentimental junk. His engineering field notebooks, the original architectural blueprints from his career, and, most importantly, the heavy brass-plated engraving tool chest. These items were legally classified as scheduled, individually inventoried estate assets. His voice echoed in the quiet office. He warned that if anyone other than the successor trustee tampered with, removed, or attempted to dispose of those specific scheduled assets, it would constitute gross interference. It would immediately open them up to severe civil liability and potential punitive damages. They were not just touching my things. They would be legally tampering with a protected financial entity. The video ended, freezing on his stern, protective expression. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, my mind racing through the implications. I had the ultimate shield. I wanted to march straight back to the townhouse, slam the trust certificate down on the coffee table, and order them to get out of my property. But Evelyn raised a hand, stopping my train of thought. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She told me that showing my hand right now would be a monumental tactical error. If I presented the documents today, they would simply back off, claim it was all a misunderstanding, and spend the next 5 years finding subtle, insidious ways to make my life a living hell. They would play the victims. Evelyn instructed me to remain completely silent about the trust. She told me to let them feel powerful, let them become overconfident, let them believe they were successfully pushing me out. We needed them to act on their malicious intentions, not just talk about them. If they committed an overt, documented act of interference after receiving a standard cease and desist warning, any judge in the state would bring the absolute heaviest hammer down on them. We needed them to cross the line, firmly and unmistakably. It went against every instinct I had to let them win the day. But my professional training recognized the flawless logic in her strategy. As a compliance officer, I knew that the most damning evidence is always generated when the subject believes no one is watching. Evelyn printed a formal letter of engagement and a power of attorney authorization. I read through every single line with meticulous care before signing my name at the bottom in blue ink. She handed me an encrypted digital drive containing the high-resolution scans of the trust documents and the original file of my grandfather's video. Right there in her office, I connected the drive to my phone. I uploaded the files into a deeply buried, double password-protected vault on my personal cloud server. I began to construct a multi-layered response protocol in my head. I was no longer an overwhelmed sister trying to survive a family argument. I was a senior risk analyst conducting a hostile threat audit. I started categorizing their potential actions, assigning risk probabilities, and preparing the exact countermeasures required for each scenario. I shook Evelyn's hand and walked out of the 19th century brownstone into the freezing Baltimore morning. The wind whipped my hair across my face, but I did not feel the cold. For my entire life, I had existed in a constant state of defensive anxiety. I had always been the one bracing for the impact of their demands, their insults, and their endless financial crises. I had always been the prey trying to minimize the damage. But as I walked down the brick-paved sidewalk, a strange, foreign sensation bloomed in my chest. The fear was completely gone. I was no longer just waiting to be attacked. I held the irrefutable proof. I knew the exact legal procedure. I controlled the timeline. They thought they were the ones setting a trap for me, but they were blindly walking into a reinforced concrete vault, and I was the only one holding the combination to the lock. The next 48 hours required a level of emotional restraint I did not know I possessed. I initiated the first phase of my countermeasure by calling my mother on a Tuesday afternoon. I kept my voice soft, injecting just enough hesitation and fatigue to make it sound entirely authentic. I told her I was completely exhausted from fighting a losing battle. I said I did not want to be the reason our family shattered into irreparable pieces, and I agreed to find a temporary short-term rental so the escalating tension could finally cool down. It was a highly calculated retreat, a false flag operation specifically designed to feed their massive egos. I knew that if I played the role of the defeated, compliant daughter, they would drop their guard completely. The bait was taken with embarrassing speed. Brooke, wholly convinced she had broken my spirit, wasted no time escalating her aggression to establish physical dominance. The very next afternoon, she let herself into the townhouse using a spare brass key she had copied without my permission months ago before I tightened the property's security. I was in the kitchen when she threw the heavy wooden front door open so hard it bounced against the wall. She did not ask if I had found a place to stay. She did not offer a single word of forced sympathy or logistical help. Instead, she marched directly into the center of the hallway, crossed her arms over her expensive designer coat, and issued a strict 72-hour ultimatum. She announced, her voice dripping with unearned authority, that I had exactly 3 days to clear out every single trace of my existence, or she would personally hire a junk removal crew to dispose of whatever was left behind. I did not argue. I simply nodded, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor, playing the role of the overwhelmed, beaten older sister flawlessly. The precise moment her luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, the pathetic performance ended permanently. My mind shifted back into full operational compliance mode. I grabbed my digital tablet and began a surgical, room-by-room inventory of the entire property. I segregated my belongings into two distinctly separate categories. The first category was critical protected assets. This included all sensitive financial documents, my encrypted solid-state backup drives, irreplaceable sentimental keepsakes, and crucially, the specific vintage heritage tools explicitly listed in the estate inventory. I also secured anything they could potentially twist, damage, or misrepresent to fabricate a false narrative against me later in a courtroom. To physically move these items without alerting the nosy neighborhood or triggering any immediate suspicion from my family, I enlisted the help of my closest friend, Nora Keats. Nora is a senior digital archivist for a major architectural firm. She understands the paramount importance of secure data preservation and absolute discretion better than anyone I have ever met. Late that evening, well after midnight, Nora arrived under the cover of darkness in a rented, unmarked white cargo van. We parked the heavy vehicle entirely out of sight in the narrow, unlit rear alley behind the townhouse, working in complete, synchronized silence. We executed dozens of small, methodical trips through the back utility door. We moved the critical assets out of the house, treating every single cardboard box and plastic bin like highly volatile hazardous material. There was no slamming of heavy doors, no loud, echoing conversations, and absolutely no visible moving trucks parked boldly on the main street under the streetlights. It was a perfectly executed phantom relocation. However, leaving the house entirely bare and empty would have instantly ruined the tactical illusion. I needed Brooke to walk in and feel the immediate thrill of a physical conquest. So, I meticulously engineered a series of physical decoys. I packed several large, bulky cardboard moving boxes with heavy, completely worthless items. I left disorganized piles of outdated, moth-eaten winter clothing, broken electronic devices I had meant to responsibly recycle years ago, and tall stacks of irrelevant junk mail artfully arranged to look exactly like I had packed up my life in a desperate, weeping panic. I intentionally left these bait boxes scattered carelessly throughout the rooms. It was precisely enough manufactured clutter to make them genuinely believe they were successfully teaching me a harsh, unforgettable lesson about respect and family hierarchy. Once the physical environment was perfectly staged to feed their delusions, I turned my absolute attention to the digital perimeter of the property. I replaced the tiny lithium batteries in the hidden exterior doorbell camera, ensuring it had a fresh, full charge fully capable of recording continuous high-definition motion-activated footage for the next 3 solid months. I synchronized the smart deadbolt access logs directly to my secure, off-site cloud server, setting up an encrypted alert system that would silently ping my personal tablet the exact moment anyone turned the lock. Moving systematically from the damp basement all the way up to the dusty attic, I photographed every single square inch of the property. I made sure the digital time and date stamps were burned directly and permanently into the raw image files, capturing the exact pristine condition of the painted walls, the polished floors, and the antique fixtures. I immediately transmitted this entire massive batch of before, during, and after evidence directly to Evelyn as a verified, legally admissible baseline. My favorite defensive measure, however, was entirely invisible to the naked eye. Sitting at my kitchen island with my secure laptop, I wrote a custom automated script. I linked my phone's primary messaging application and digital call history directly to my secure legal archive. From that exact moment forward, every single text message sent to the toxic family group chat, every frantic voicemail, and every digital interaction was instantly duplicated, heavily encrypted, and filed into a remote, untouchable server. They could hastily delete their cruel messages all they wanted in the future. I would always possess the original, unedited receipt safely locked away. Before I finally walked out the heavy front door with my single overnight travel bag, I executed one last tactical maneuver. I opened the top drawer of the kitchen counter, the specific one where we traditionally kept old takeout menus, spare batteries, and emergency flashlights, right in the very center, impossible to miss if you were snooping. I placed a single, crisp white envelope. It was firmly sealed. Inside was a certified copy of the formal legal notice, officially signed by Evelyn, explicitly forbidding unauthorized persons from trespassing or interfering with the estate property. I did not leave it out on the counter where it could be immediately construed as a direct, aggressive threat. I left it hidden in a private space, knowing with absolute certainty they would inevitably snoop through the closed drawers the moment they thought they had full, uncontested run of the house. I stepped outside and locked the front door, pulling the handle tight to ensure the metal latch caught perfectly. Later that very same night, while sitting comfortably on the sofa in Nora's quiet guest bedroom across the city, my phone screen quietly illuminated the dark room. It was a new image uploaded directly to the family group chat. Brooke had taken a bright, smiling selfie standing triumphantly in the exact middle of the Hampton townhouse living room. She sent it to our parents with a gloating caption bragging that she had finally won and that the house was officially secured. I stared calmly at the high-resolution photograph, noting the smug, arrogant satisfaction radiating from her expression. My father instantly replied with a yellow thumbs-up symbol. My mother sent a long string of celebratory red heart icons. All three of them were blinded by their perceived, unearned victory. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting silently in the dark, watching the invisible digital trap snap firmly shut around them, patiently waiting for them to take one more arrogant step across a very strict, unforgiving legal boundary. The sleek, temperature-controlled lobby of Meridian Arc Risk Labs was designed to project absolute corporate authority. The floors were polished white marble, the walls lined with acoustic paneling that absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere of hushed, focused professionalism. At exactly 14 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, that carefully constructed tranquility was violently shattered. I was in the middle of a risk assessment audit on the 14th floor when my desk extension chimed. The head receptionist sounded remarkably tense. She informed me that 3 individuals claiming to be my immediate relatives were currently causing a severe disturbance at the front security desk, demanding I come down immediately to, as they phrased it, settle the score. I did not rush. I saved my spreadsheet, locked my workstation, and took the glass elevator down to the ground floor. The moment the elevator doors slid silently open, the shrill, echoing sound of my sister's voice hit me. Brooke was standing dead center in the massive lobby, wearing the same expensive designer coat from yesterday. But her carefully crafted aesthetic had completely unraveled. Beside her, my father was red in the face, gesturing aggressively at the reinforced security turnstiles, while my mother hovered a few steps back, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, perfectly positioned to play the grieving matriarch. They had come to my place of business to weaponize my professional reputation against me. It was a classic escalation tactic. As I stepped out of the elevator bay, Brooke spotted me. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice echoing off the marble walls for every passing executive and junior analyst to hear. She screamed that I was a thief, that I was actively stealing the family home out from under them, and that I had maliciously thrown my own flesh and blood out onto the freezing streets. She simplified the narrative into a digestible, sensationalized soundbite, perfectly engineered to make any eavesdropping colleague assume I was a monstrous, greedy villain. My father stepped forward, his chest puffed out, clearly expecting me to shrink away in absolute mortification. He expected me to desperately usher them into a private conference room to contain the public humiliation, thereby giving them a captive audience to enforce their demands. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from them. I did not raise my hands defensively. I did not utter a single word of rebuttal. I simply turned my head to the head receptionist, who was watching the scene with wide, alarmed eyes. Keeping my voice at a calm, conversational volume, I instructed her to immediately initiate a Level 2 security response. I then explicitly requested that she flag the lobby closed-circuit television feeds from the past 20 minutes for permanent archival preservation, citing a direct physical threat to an employee. Hearing the word threat completely broke Brooke's fragile grip on reality. Seeing two uniformed building security officers stepping out from the corridor, she realized her intimidation tactic was failing spectacularly. Panic and rage overtook her entirely. She reached into her handbag, pulled out her smartphone, and aggressively jabbed at the screen. Within seconds, she hoisted the phone high into the air. The camera lens pointed directly at my face. She had initiated a live video broadcast on her primary social media account. The performance she delivered was horrifyingly dramatic. Real tears streamed down her flushed face as she stared into her own front-facing camera, feeding a live audience a completely fabricated story. She wailed that her cruel older sister was abusing the legal system to render her homeless. She painted a picture of absolute devastation, sobbing about how she had nowhere to sleep, all while panning the camera around the luxurious corporate lobby to highlight the vast financial disparities she was imagining between us. I stood perfectly still, letting her broadcast my complete lack of reaction. I knew something she did not. Before I even stepped onto the elevator, I had sent a 2-word text message to Nora monitor her. I knew with absolute certainty that Nora was currently sitting at her secure workstation across the city, capturing the live feed in real time. Nora was actively screen recording the broadcast, saving the exact web address, documenting every single viewer comment, and logging the raw timestamp data before Brooke could inevitably realize her mistake and attempt to delete the footage. Brooke continued her frantic, weeping monologue, pacing back and forth in front of the security turnstiles. The security officers approached slowly, holding up their hands, firmly requesting that she lower the recording device and vacate the private premises. The perceived authority of the uniformed guards pushed Brooke over the edge. She spun back toward the camera, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch, in her desperate, blind attempt to prove just how far I had supposedly pushed her. Her brain entirely abandoned any filter. She shrieked directly into the microphone that I had completely abandoned them, forcing her hand. She yelled, verbatim, that she had been forced to call a commercial locksmith first thing in the morning just to get inside the house before I could come back and lock them out forever. The polished lobby went dead silent. Even my mother stopped dabbing her fake tears. I blinked, my face an impenetrable mask, but internally, my heart hammered with the thrill of absolute victory. She had just confessed, on a live, public, recorded digital broadcast. She had explicitly admitted to premeditating and executing a forced, unauthorized entry into a protected property. She had publicly verified the exact timeline of the locksmith van reflection from her earlier photograph. My father, despite his arrogance, possessed just enough rudimentary self-preservation to realize what his youngest daughter had just done. The color instantly drained from his face. He lunged forward, his heavy hands reaching out to snatch the device away from Brooke. He yelled at her to shut her mouth and turn the application off. Brooke shrieked, twisting away from him to protect the broadcast. The phone violently shook in her hand, the camera wildly panning across the marble floor, the ceiling, and finally zooming blurrily onto my father's chest as he wrestled the device from her grip. For exactly 3 seconds, the wildly shaking camera lens clearly captured my father's left hand. Crushed tightly in his fist was a thick, disorganized stack of crumpled white papers. The camera resolution was high enough to clearly make out the bold, distinctive header font of a legal document. Specifically, the photocopied pages of my grandfather's estate paperwork that they had illegally rummaged from my private filing cabinet 8 days prior. It was the ultimate, undeniable visual proof of their coordinated theft. The security officers finally intervened, stepping firmly between my father and sister. The lead guard, a tall man with a severe expression, loudly informed them that the police would be dispatched in exactly 2 minutes if they did not exit through the revolving doors immediately. My mother grabbed Brooke by the arm, her face pale with sudden, terrifying realization. Dennis finally managed to kill the live broadcast, shoving the phone into his coat pocket, breathing heavily as the guards began physically herding them backward toward the street exit. Brooke stumbled backward, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. She screamed at me one last time, demanding that I fix this, demanding that I act like a real family member. I took one single step forward, bringing myself just close enough so that my voice would carry clearly over the shuffling footsteps and the sliding glass doors. I looked directly into Brooke's frantic eyes, then shifted my gaze to my father, and finally to my mother. From this exact second forward, I stated, my tone colder than the winter air rushing in from the street, every single thing you have to say to me goes directly through my attorney. I did not wait to watch the heavy glass doors close behind them. I turned my back on the people who had terrorized me for 33 years and walked calmly back toward the elevators, leaving them to finally understand that they were no longer dealing with a compliant daughter. They were dealing with a hostile corporate audit, and they had just handed me every single piece of evidence required to finish the case against them. The air inside Evelyn Cross's office that evening was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of fresh laser printer ink and the heavy weight of impending litigation. The sun had long since set over the Baltimore skyline, but neither of us showed any intention of leaving. The frantic public spectacle my family had staged in my corporate lobby a few hours prior was the final catalyst we needed. They had aggressively played their hand in the open, and now, it was time to bring the full weight of the legal process down on them. Evelyn did not hesitate. Sitting behind her massive mahogany desk, she drafted an emergency petition for a temporary protective order of possession. The legal language she employed was brilliant, cold, and entirely merciless. She formally requested an immediate, court-mandated injunction barring my father, my mother, and my sister from coming within 500 feet of the Hampton townhouse. The petition explicitly prohibited them from accessing the premises, altering the locks, or attempting to transfer, remove, or sell a single piece of property located within the estate boundaries. To support the injunction, I provided Evelyn with the ultimate ammunition package. It was a flawless, chronological chain of irrefutable evidence. I handed over the pristine, time-stamped baseline photographs proving the exact condition of the home before I legally vacated it. I provided the encrypted digital smart lock access logs, highlighting the precise minute the perimeter was breached. I submitted the unhinged, abusive transcripts from the family group chat, the frantic, sweating voicemails my father had left, and the high-definition screen capture Nora had secured of Brooke's disastrous livestream. The judicial system typically moves at a slow, agonizing crawl, but when presented with concrete, undeniable proof of active property tampering and coordinated harassment, the courts can act with unusual speed. A municipal judge reviewed our comprehensive filing the very next morning. The temporary order was granted in less than 24 hours. It effectively froze the entire battlefield, locking my family inside the house with a legal mandate that forbade them from touching anything, while simultaneously setting an emergency evidentiary hearing for exactly 14 days later. While the court processed the injunction, Evelyn executed a parallel strike. She drafted a formal legal inquiry, laden with the threat of secondary liability, and dispatched it directly to the corporate headquarters of the commercial locksmith service whose van had been accidentally reflected in Brooke's triumphant photograph. The company's legal department responded with terrifying speed, desperate to distance themselves from a potential felony trespassing charge. They electronically transmitted a digitized copy of the emergency work order and the liability waiver their field technician had required before drilling out the smart deadbolt. Sitting beside Evelyn, I reviewed the scanned document on her secondary monitor. The client who authorized the destruction of the lock had confidently checked a box claiming to be the verified, legal co-owner of the residential property. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. There, pressed hard into the paper, was the unmistakable, aggressive signature of my father. I was completely repulsed, yet entirely unsurprised by his sheer arrogance. But my eyes caught something else on the form that made my blood run instantly cold. Next to my father's signature was a formal blue ink stamp and a messy signature from a supposed witness and notary public, validating his fraudulent claim of ownership. I memorized the 6-digit notary commission number printed beneath the stamp. I pulled out my secure tablet, accessed the state registry portal, and ran a rapid background query. The database pinged a bright red error message. The notary credential attached to that specific stamp had officially expired exactly 8 months and 12 days prior. My father had not simply lied to an independent contractor. He had utilized a fraudulently verified legal instrument to forcefully bypass a residential security system. He was layering crimes on top of crimes. Just as I was processing the sheer magnitude of his forged document, my secure messaging application chimed. It was a high-priority encrypted link from Nora. I opened the link, and a new wave of disgust washed over me. Brooke had not been sitting idle while waiting for the dust to settle. She had launched a massive, highly publicized digital crowdfunding campaign. The banner image plastered across the top of the donation page was the exact same photograph of my discarded personal belongings piled beside the alleyway trash cans. However, in Brooke's completely fabricated reality, the context of the image was entirely inverted. She had penned a long, tear-jerking essay beneath the photo, explicitly naming me. She claimed that I, her wealthy and heartless older sister, had violently evicted them without notice. She painted a horrifying, completely fictitious narrative where she was the desperate victim, struggling to keep our elderly, vulnerable parents from freezing on the streets while I selfishly hoarded generational wealth. At the bottom of the page, a green progress bar showed she was actively soliciting $50,000 in emergency public relief. Evelyn leaned over, reading the campaign description over my shoulder. She let out a low, sharp breath. This was a monumental tactical error on Brooke's part. By publishing that story and attaching a monetary goal to it, she had successfully crossed the threshold from a localized family dispute into documented, monetized civil fraud and defamation per se. Every single dollar she collected from sympathetic strangers was another iron nail driven directly into her legal coffin. The board was no longer just tilted in my favor. It had completely flipped upside down to crush them. A normal person might have felt a surge of euphoric triumph upon realizing their abusers had handed them the keys to their own destruction. Evelyn certainly expected me to smile, to celebrate the absolute airtight nature of our impending victory. But I did not smile. My posture remained rigid. The cold, analytical compliance officer inside my mind recognized a dark, fundamental truth about human nature. The tighter the legal noose gets, the harder the trapped animal thrashes. I knew my family. As the court date rapidly approached, they would not suddenly realize the error of their ways. They would not surrender gracefully. They would abandon all logic, all morality, and resort to pure, unadulterated desperation. They would lie under oath. They would fabricate entirely new, increasingly implausible stories to save themselves from the consequences of their own actions. Evelyn shut her laptop, the sharp click echoing in the quiet office. She looked at me, her expression shifting from professional satisfaction to grave, serious warning. She folded her hands on the desk and told me to brace my mind for the coming storm. She explained that proving we were legally right was already finished. We had the documents, we had the video, we had the fraud and the defamation. But the upcoming battle in the courtroom was not going to be a simple presentation of facts. The next step was going to require ripping open the darkest, ugliest rot beneath their actions. We were going to have to force them to the witness stand and drag out the entire, pathetic reason why they were desperate enough to risk federal fraud, public humiliation, and total financial ruin just to steal a brick townhouse in Baltimore. The real horror, Evelyn warned softly, was finally discovering exactly what kind of monsters I had been living with my entire life. The discovery phase of civil litigation is a grueling, unglamorous process of exhuming the dead. For the next 10 days, the polished mahogany conference table in Evelyn Cross's law firm transformed into a forensic accounting laboratory. Through a series of aggressive, court-mandated subpoenas, we compelled the release of every single financial record, banking ledger, and digital communication associated with my family over the past 5 years. As a senior data compliance officer, I was in my absolute element. I did not view them as my parents or my sister anymore. I viewed them as a hostile corporate syndicate actively hiding a massive operational deficit. We began our audit by examining my grandfather's primary checking accounts during the final 18 months of his life, a period when his physical health had kept him largely confined to his bed. Sitting side by side with Evelyn, running a customized data extraction algorithm over thousands of lines of banking statements, I isolated the anomaly almost immediately. It began as a slow, quiet bleed. There were continuous, highly irregular transfers occurring every single week. $500 here, $800 there. Occasionally, a larger wire transfer of exactly $2,500 would vanish entirely from his fixed retirement savings. I traced the routing numbers. The money was not going toward his medical bills or home nursing care. Every single stolen cent was being funneled directly into a joint checking account held by my father and mother. But the money did not stay there. Within 24 hours of hitting my parents' account, the exact same funds were wired back out, deposited straight into the commercial operating account of Brooke's failing e-commerce business. My parents had not merely been overly supportive of her terrible entrepreneurial dreams. They had actively, systematically stolen from a dying man to artificially keep her sinking company afloat. They had paid for her commercial warehouse rent, her aggressive social media advertising campaigns, and her inflated daily operational costs using the money my grandfather had meticulously saved for decades. This revelation cracked the entire case wide open, but the financial wreckage went even deeper. Evelyn pulled the commercial lease agreements Brooke had signed for her business. As we read through the dense liability clauses, the true, terrifying scope of Brooke's desperation finally materialized. Brooke had not just formed a limited liability company to secure her massive warehouse space. She had foolishly signed a strict personal guarantee. Her business was entirely bankrupt, and now her commercial landlord and a syndicate of private suppliers were preparing to sue her personally for over $150,000 in unpaid debts. If she could not prove she had a stable, permanent primary residence and significant familial asset support to leverage for a debt restructuring loan, she was going to be completely destroyed by cross-litigation. Her creditors would seize her luxury vehicle, freeze her bank accounts, and garnish any future wages she might ever earn. The timeline clicked together with horrifying precision. That was the exact reason they had ambushed me in the living room. That was the reason they had issued a frantic 72-hour ultimatum to vacate the townhouse. They were completely out of stolen cash, and the bad debt was about to hit the public court dockets. They needed to physically control the Hampton property to fake a legitimate residential address and project a false image of generational wealth to hold off her furious creditors. However, the most devastating piece of evidence did not come from the banking ledgers. It came from the digital forensics. Evelyn had subpoenaed the cellular service providers, recovering a massive cache of supposedly deleted text messages sent between my family members during the week they plotted my eviction. I sat in the silent law office, staring at a printed transcript of a conversation between Brooke and my mother, Elaine. For my entire life, Elaine had expertly played the role of the soft, weeping peacekeeper. She was the one who always begged for compromise, hiding behind a mask of maternal concern. But the recovered text messages stripped that mask away, revealing a cold, calculating architect of psychological abuse. Brooke had texted her, complaining that I was asking too many questions about the property taxes. My mother's response was time-stamped at 2 in the morning. She wrote, "Just get her to move out. Once she is physically out of the house, she will fold. Use the group chat. Shame her publicly. Take pictures of her garbage. She is terrified of confrontation. Dad will handle the legal paperwork later." Reading those specific words felt like swallowing broken glass. The public shaming, the photograph of my belongings rotting by the alleyway trash cans, the brutal mockery on the morning train. None of it was a spontaneous outburst of sibling rivalry. It was a calculated, premeditated psychological warfare tactic drafted by my own mother. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to make me surrender, and she had weaponized my lifelong desire for peace against me. The sheer weight of our discovery packet was monumental. We had the theft, the commercial debt motive, the premeditated harassment strategy, and the forged locksmith documents. Evelyn compiled a preliminary disclosure binder and formally served it to the defense attorney my father had hastily hired. Exactly 4 hours after the courier delivered the binder, the heavy brass telephone on Evelyn's desk rang. She placed the call on the central speakerphone. The voice of the opposing counsel filled the room. He sounded exhausted, completely stripped of the usual combative arrogance that defense attorneys project. He stammered slightly, clearing his throat before proposing a private, immediate settlement. He stated that his clients were willing to unconditionally surrender the keys, permanently vacate the premises, and sign a binding non-disclosure agreement. In exchange, they begged me to drop the defamation charges, seal the fraudulent locksmith records, and cancel the upcoming evidentiary hearing. They were desperately trying to limit the catastrophic damage they had brought upon themselves, still cowardly refusing to officially admit to the trespassing and the theft. Evelyn muted the microphone and looked across the desk at me, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. The easiest path was right in front of me. I could take the house back today and never speak to them again. I leaned forward, my hands resting flat against the cool, polished wood of the conference table. I looked at the printed transcript of my mother's cruel, manipulative text messages. I thought about the 33 years I had spent shrinking myself to accommodate their boundless greed. I shook my head. I instructed Evelyn to unmute the line. I spoke directly toward the speaker, my voice perfectly level. I told the attorney that there would be absolutely no private settlement and no quiet surrender. I rejected their offer entirely. I wanted the full evidentiary hearing to proceed exactly as scheduled. This was no longer just a legal dispute over a brick townhouse in Baltimore. This was a reckoning. I was going to force my father, my mother, and my sister to sit under oath in a public courtroom. I was going to make them listen as their financial crimes, their lies, and their absolute moral bankruptcy were read into the permanent public record. They had spent a lifetime treating me like an expendable asset, and I was finally going to show them exactly what happens when the asset decides to audit the company. Exactly 48 hours before the hearing, opposing counsel made a second settlement attempt. A courier delivered a revised proposal that repeated the same core demand in different packaging my family would vacate and return the keys only if I withdrew key claims and kept the case out of the public record. Evelyn read it, called it a stalling tactic, and advised me to reject it again unless they signed an irrevocable admission of liability. I refused. She pointed out the obvious truth. They were completely terrified. They knew the live stream recording, the forged entry documents, and the stolen financial records were about to be entered into the permanent, unsealed public domain. They were desperately trying to buy my silence using the very property I already legally owned. Evelyn strictly advised me against yielding a single inch. She warned that without a signed, irrevocable admission of civil liability, my parents could easily twist the narrative years later, claiming to their social circles that they magnanimously gifted me the house out of the goodness of their hearts. I did not hesitate. I firmly rejected the offer and instructed Evelyn to prepare for full litigation. The blunt rejection of their settlement sent a violent shockwave through their ranks, completely shattering whatever fragile, toxic alliance they had left. That night, at exactly 11:45, my secure phone screen illuminated the dark, quiet bedroom of Nora's apartment. It was a direct, unencrypted cellular call from Brooke, against my better judgment, and purely out of tactical curiosity. I answered the call, letting the line sit in a heavy, unbroken silence. Brooke's voice was completely stripped of her usual arrogant venom. She sounded small, frantic, and entirely cornered. She whispered hurriedly into the receiver, her breathing shallow and fast. She claimed she wanted to tell me the absolute truth about everything, in a breathtaking display of disloyalty. She desperately tried to throw our parents directly under the proverbial bus. She frantically implied that Dennis and Elaine were the true, malicious masterminds who had orchestrated the entire hostile takeover from the very beginning. She painted herself as a mere pawn, a victim manipulated into participating only because she was drowning under the massive debt of her failing e-commerce business. I recognized the manipulation tactic instantly. She was trying to sever her own liability from the sinking ship, hoping I would take pity on my younger sister and aim my legal artillery exclusively at our parents. I did not offer her a single ounce of absolution. I did not agree to a private, secret meeting, keeping my voice entirely devoid of any sisterly warmth or familial obligation. I stated clearly that any further communication must be routed strictly through our respective legal representatives. Brooke's fragile, victimized facade instantly shattered into a million pieces. She screamed a string of vicious, hateful curses into the receiver before violently terminating the connection. Denied a private exit strategy, Brooke immediately resorted to her favorite, highly destructive weapon. Within 30 minutes of hanging up on me, my tablet pinged with an urgent notification from Nora. Brooke had published a vague, highly inflammatory status update on her primary social media feed. She did not explicitly use my name to avoid a direct libel charge, but she painted a tragic, dramatic picture of being betrayed by someone she trusted most, actively trying to incite blind outrage among her remaining digital followers. Simultaneously, panic clearly set in regarding her fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. She logged into the donation platform in the middle of the night, aggressively editing the original campaign description. She attempted to soften the harsh, defamatory language she had initially used to describe me abandoning our elderly parents, realizing those words were actively being used against her in a court of law. Finally, realizing the danger, she completely locked the page from public view. Unfortunately for her, she fundamentally misunderstood how professional digital archiving actually works. Nora had already secured the entire perimeter days ago. My friend had successfully downloaded the original, highly defamatory version of the campaign, the heavily sanitized secondary version, and the final captured screenshot showing the exact total of $4,250 she had illegally raised from sympathetic strangers before restricting access. The digital paper trail of her fraud was absolutely flawless. The following morning, a massive, entirely unexpected twist arrived via a secondary subpoena return. Evelyn had cast a wide net, legally demanding records from my father's primary homeowner's insurance provider. We were simply looking for general liability coverage limits, but the insurance company blindly handed us a smoking gun of monumental proportions. 14 months prior, Dennis had secretly filed a massive property damage claim against the Hampton townhouse policy. In the official, signed insurance affidavit, he explicitly swore under penalty of perjury that I, his eldest daughter, had maliciously vandalized the interior property, claiming I had destroyed expensive antique fixtures to demand repair money. He had attempted to defraud his own insurance provider to secure a cash payout for damages that literally never happened. The sheer, staggering stupidity of his action was breathtaking. This official insurance document completely annihilated their current, desperate legal defense. They were actively planning to argue to the judge that I had voluntarily abandoned the property and left worthless trash behind. Yet, just over a year ago, Dennis had legally sworn on official documents that I was actively destroying the premises. The two narratives were mutually exclusive. He had unknowingly provided us with irrefutable, documented proof of his own chronic, documented perjury, as if the insurance fraud was not enough to bury them. Evelyn received a formal sworn deposition from the commercial locksmith. The technician, terrified of losing his state operating license and facing criminal charges, eagerly agreed to testify as a hostile witness against my father. He provided a sworn statement confirming that Dennis had aggressively assured him that I, the absent CO owner, had explicitly given verbal consent over the telephone to completely change the locks that very morning. Evelyn immediately cross-referenced the technician's statement with my securely archived cellular logs. The data was crystal clear and legally indisputable. There were 0 incoming or outgoing calls, 0 text messages, and 0 voicemails between my phone and any device owned by my family during that entire morning window. Dennis had completely fabricated my consent to bypass the security protocol. The trap was entirely sealed. Every single desperate lie they told simply generated another layer of documented fraud because of the overwhelming volume of intersecting claims. The forged notary stamp, the documented insurance fraud, and the monetized defamation. The presiding judge made a swift administrative decision. The scheduled emergency hearing was officially upgraded. We were no longer just arguing over a temporary protective order. We were walking into a consolidated, summary civil trial. The stakes had been raised to absolute maximum capacity. The morning of the trial arrived with a bitter, biting cold wind that swept forcefully off the harbor. I stood on the wide concrete steps of the municipal courthouse, pulling my heavy wool coat tightly around myself. Evelyn stood silently beside me, holding a massive black leather briefcase containing the absolute, undeniable destruction of the people who had raised me. There was no nervous fluttering in my chest. There was no lingering hesitation or doubt. For 33 years, I had been systematically conditioned to preserve the family peace at the total expense of my own sanity. I had been taught to absorb their financial mistakes, their emotional abuse, and their constant, suffocating demands. But as I looked up at the towering stone pillars of the courthouse, I understood the absolute finality of what was about to happen. Once I walked through those heavy brass doors and the judge banged the wooden gavel, every single familial tie would be permanently severed. There would be no holiday dinners. There would be no awkward, forced apologies. There would be absolutely no turning back from this ledge. I took a deep, steadying breath of the freezing morning air, lifted my chin high, and walked straight into the building to finish the war they had so arrogantly started. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 swung shut, sealing us inside a space where emotional manipulation held absolutely no jurisdiction. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Across the aisle, my family sat huddled at the defense table. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue. My father rigidly adjusted his tie, and Brooke stared at the floor. Her previous arrogance entirely dissolved into nervous energy. Their defense attorney opened the proceedings exactly as we anticipated. He did not present a single piece of hard evidence. Instead, he launched into a sweeping, theatrical monologue designed entirely to paint me as the villain. He described me as a ruthless, calculating woman who was actively hoarding generational wealth while maliciously evicting her own flesh and blood. He pleaded with the judge to consider the sanctity of the family unit, framing my refusal to surrender the Hampton property as a cruel, unnatural act of betrayal. He tried desperately to drag the entire summary trial into the murky, subjective waters of family dynamics, completely ignoring the concrete legal boundaries they had violently crossed. When it was our turn, Evelyn Cross did not match his emotional theatrics. She stood up slowly, walked to the center podium, and began methodically laying down the bricks of our impenetrable fortress. She started with the foundation. She submitted the certified trust documents, the beneficiary addendum, and the legally binding transfer of property management rights. The defense attorney's argument of a shared family home evaporated into thin air the moment the judge reviewed the crisp, notarized pages proving I was the sole, uncontested legal authority over the estate. Then, Evelyn requested permission to play the digital video file. The courtroom screens flickered to life, and my grandfather's stern, steady voice echoed through the high ceiling. He explicitly stated his complete lack of faith in my parents and specifically warned against the exact type of hostile takeover they had just attempted. The judge, a severe woman with decades of experience, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the reality of the situation came into sharp focus. But Evelyn was just getting started. She introduced the printed screenshot from our family group chat. She directed the judge's attention to Brooke's mocking message and the photograph of my belongings tossed into the public alleyway. She handed the judge the official estate inventory ledger. With surgical precision, Evelyn pointed out the heavy brass-plated tool chest, partially visible beneath the torn garbage bags. She explained that this was not merely discarded clothing. That specific item was a legally protected, scheduled asset of the trust. By physically removing it from the property and dumping it outside, my family had committed documented, unauthorized interference with a protected estate. The defense attempted to object, claiming it was a harmless mistake made during a stressful moving process. Evelyn instantly crushed their objection by calling the commercial locksmith to the witness stand. The technician looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly terrified of losing his state certification. Under oath, he testified that my father had aggressively presented himself as the primary owner of the residence and explicitly authorized the destruction of the smart deadbolt. Evelyn then projected the signed liability waiver onto the screens. She highlighted Dennis's signature right next to the fraudulently verified notary stamp. When my father was forced to take the stand to explain the discrepancy, his booming authority vanished. He stammered. He contradicted his own sworn statements from just 10 minutes prior, claiming he thought he had implicit permission, then claiming he never read the form before signing it. He dug his own grave deeper with every single word. Evelyn did not give him a moment to breathe. She transitioned seamlessly to the digital evidence. She played the raw, high-definition screen recording of Brooke's disastrous lobby livestream. The entire courtroom watched as my sister frantically confessed, to a live public audience, that she had proactively called the locksmith early in the morning to break into the house before I could return. Then came the final, devastating blow to their credibility. Evelyn introduced the fraudulent online crowdfunding campaign Brooke had launched, where she raised thousands of dollars by publicly defaming my character. Immediately after submitting the campaign records, Evelyn submitted the official homeowner's insurance claim Dennis had filed over a year ago. She placed the two documents side by side on the overhead projector. In one document, Brooke claimed I had cruelly abandoned the property and left them with nothing but trash. In the other legally binding document, Dennis swore under penalty of perjury that I was actively living in the house and maliciously destroying the interior fixtures. Evelyn looked directly at the judge and stated that it was mathematically impossible for both of those narratives to be true. But it was entirely certain that my family was willing to lie to anyone, in any venue, to secure a financial advantage. The judge's expression hardened into pure granite. The defense had absolutely zero credibility left. The climax of the trial occurred when Brooke was subjected to cross-examination. Evelyn pressed her relentlessly about the underlying motive. She brought up the failing e-commerce business, the unpaid warehouse leases, and the crushing personal guarantee hovering over Brooke's head. Under the intense, unforgiving pressure of the courtroom, Brooke finally broke. She burst into genuine, ugly tears, her voice cracking. She confessed everything. She admitted she always knew the house did not fully belong to our parents. She confessed that they had all colluded to push me out simply because her creditors were closing in, and they desperately needed the physical property to shield her from imminent financial ruin. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack. The ruling was absolute and entirely one-sided. The judge validated my complete legal control over the Hampton townhouse under the terms of the trust. But she did not stop there. She ordered Dennis, Elaine, and Brooke to pay sweeping financial restitution. They were held jointly liable for the physical damage to the property. the costs of the unauthorized locksmith, and every single cent of my extensive legal fees. Furthermore, the judge awarded significant civil damages for the public defamation and coordinated harassment. To ensure my permanent safety, she granted a comprehensive, long-term restraining order barring all three of them from coming anywhere near me or my property. The trial ended abruptly, leaving no room for a tearful, dramatic epilogue. I did not look back at them as I walked out of the courtroom. The very next morning, I stood on the porch of the Hampton townhouse. A legally bonded, highly recommended security firm was installing a brand new, biometric locking system on the front door. I walked inside, the house quiet and finally completely mine. Over the next few months, I restored the property. I cleared out the chaotic energy they had left behind, honoring a conversation I had with my grandfather years before he passed. I converted the spacious front parlor on the ground floor into a small, welcoming community consulting studio, helping local residents navigate the confusing, intimidating world of municipal paperwork and estate planning. As for my family, I severed the connection completely. There were no angry text messages, no final screaming matches, and absolutely no attempts at reconciliation. I cut them out of my life permanently. I did not do it out of sudden, impulsive hatred. I did it because, after 33 years of being their sacrificial lamb, I finally understood the truth. My peace of mind was not a luxury they could endlessly steal from me. It was a tangible, valuable property right, and I had just utilized the full force of the law to take it back forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I would love to invite you to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.